In the 1700s, the greatest military superpower on Earth was completely paralyzed, not by an enemy fleet, not by a plague, because they ran out of straight pieces of wood. The British Navy, the terrifying engine that held a global empire together, had completely deforested its own island. Every ancient forest on the British Isles had been burned for fuel, cleared for farmland, or swallowed by the insatiable demand of industry. And now the consequences had arrived. Their massive warships, the most complex machines ever built at the time, required a single, unbroken, 100-foot piece of timber for a main mast, not two pieces joined together. Not three planks bolted side by side, one continuous piece of flawless wood, and Britain had none left. Not a single tree on the entire island was tall enough, straight enough, or strong enough to serve as the spine of a warship. The most powerful navy in human history was grounded. And the reason was so absurdly simple, it's almost hard to believe. Think about what the British Navy actually was in the 18th century. It wasn't just a military branch. It was the operating system of the entire British Empire. Their warships were their satellites, their internet cables, and their nuclear deterrent, all rolled into one. Without the Navy, there was no trade, no colonies, no empire. Everything depended on those ships being able to sail, and the crown jewel of that fleet was the ship of the line. A first-rate warship carrying over 100 cannons, crewed by hundreds of men, engineered to dominate any naval engagement on Earth. It was the most expensive, most complex machine of its era. Building one took years and consumed an almost absurd amount of resources, but every single one of those ships had a critical vulnerability. The main mast. The mast wasn't decorative. It was the spine. It absorbed the colossal force of the wind, translated it into forward motion, and kept the entire vessel stable during storms. If the mast failed, the ship was dead. 100 cannons, 1,000 men, none of it mattered. Without a functioning mast, the greatest warship on Earth was just a floating piece of dead wood drifting wherever the current decided to take it. Now here's the thing. By the mid-1700s, England didn't just have a shortage of mast timber. They had zero. The island was an ecological desert for large trees. And the solution they came up with would end up igniting one of the most important revolutions in human history. But finding the perfect tree was only half the problem. Getting it out of the forest would require an engineering miracle and spark a war. To understand how a global superpower corners itself into something this absurd, you need to look at the sheer, overwhelming scale of 18th century shipbuilding. A single ship of the line consumed over 3,000 mature oak trees. Oak was the backbone of the hull, dense, hard, excellent at absorbing the impact of a cannonball without shattering into lethal splinters. But oak is heavy, and it almost never grows perfectly straight. You can build a hull from oak. You cannot build a mast from it. For a mast, you needed the exact opposite, something lightweight, so it wouldn't make the ship dangerously top-heavy, something flexible, so it could bend under the savage force of a hurricane without snapping in half and killing everyone below, and it had to grow perfectly straight for over 100 feet. No curves, no knots, no weak spots. There's only one type of wood on the planet that meets all of those requirements at the same time: pine. And Britain had cut their pines down centuries ago. So for generations, the Royal Navy survived by importing massive pine trunks from the Baltic region, places like Riga, Danzig, and the forests of Prussia. Enormous trees, felled in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, dragged to port cities, loaded onto merchant ships, and hauled across the North Sea to British dockyards. It worked for a while. But that supply chain had a single, terrifying choke point. The entire Baltic Sea connects to the Atlantic through one narrow passage, the Øresund strait, barely 2 miles wide at its narrowest. If a hostile power, France, Spain, Denmark, anyone, decided to blockade that strait, Britain's entire supply of mast timber would be cut off instantly, overnight. No warning, no alternative, no backup plan. The Admiralty understood exactly how fragile this was. They were the undisputed masters of every ocean on Earth, but they didn't control the raw material that allowed them to sail. Their global dominance was hanging by a thread, and that thread was a narrow strip of Scandinavian water controlled by someone else. They needed a domestic, secure, guaranteed source of massive pine trees, and they needed it immediately, because without it, the British Empire had an expiration date. They found it 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean in the dense, seemingly infinite forests of the American colonies, the eastern white pine. These trees were something else entirely. Biological anomalies. They grew up to 200 feet tall, arrow-straight, with trunks so perfectly cylindrical they looked engineered. The wood was strong but lightweight, flexible but resilient. Resistant to rot in a way that almost seemed designed for naval architecture. For the British Admiralty, discovering the white pine forests of New England was like stumbling onto an untapped oil reserve the size of a continent, but getting them out of those forests. That was a different problem entirely. You couldn't just chop down a 200-foot tree and drag it away. A tree that massive, falling uncontrolled, would shatter on impact. The trunk would crack and split, and months of scouting and planning would be wasted in a single second. So the lumberjacks' specialized workers called mastmen had to engineer the fall. They would spend days clearing a path and building a cushioned bed of smaller trees and dense brush to absorb the impact. Every cut had to be precise. One miscalculation, and the most valuable piece of timber on the continent was kindling, and once the tree was down, the real nightmare began. A single mast tree weighed dozens of tons. Moving it through roadless wilderness, over frozen rivers, and down to a coastal port required teams of up to 100 oxen, dragging the trunk through deep winter snow, mile after agonizing mile. It was brutal, grueling, and borderline impossible just to transport one piece of wood. To secure this vital lifeline, the British government made a fatal miscalculation. They implemented one of the most aggressive resource seizure policies in colonial history, the broad arrow policy. Royal surveyors fanned out across the dense New England forests, inspecting every massive white pine they could find. When they identified one worthy of the king's fleet, they took a hatchet and carved 3 deep cuts into the bark, forming a shape known as the broad arrow. That mark meant the tree was crown. Property. Instantly. No negotiation. The British Crown didn't just tax the colonists, they occupied their forests. Any colonist caught cutting down a broad arrow tree, even to build a home, even to survive the winter, faced devastating fines, seizure of their property, or imprisonment. It wasn't an abstract tax on paper. It was a physical claim on the land they lived on and the resources they needed to exist. Forget the Boston Tea Party for a moment. Forget no taxation without representation. Those are the clean, classroom-friendly versions of what happened. On the ground, in the freezing woods of New Hampshire and Maine, the American Revolution was a desperate, visceral resource war. The colonists needed that exact same wood, the same white pines to build their homes, heat their families through brutal winters, construct their sawmills, and build their own merchant ships. The king's surveyors weren't just marking trees, they were claiming the colonists' future, and the colonists started fighting back. They organized in secret. They disguised themselves, crept into the forests at night, and felled the king's marked pines under the cover of darkness. Then they immediately milled the stolen trunks into boards, destroying the evidence. A perfect, crown-stamped mast tree would disappear overnight, and by morning there was nothing left but sawdust and a pile of anonymous lumber. The tension boiled over in 1772 with the Pine Tree Riot in Weir, New Hampshire. When a sheriff tried to arrest colonists for illegally cutting broad arrow pines, a mob physically attacked the British officials, beat them, and drove them out of town. It was raw, furious, and deeply personal. This wasn't a philosophical debate about governance. This was people defending the physical resources they needed to live. And when the Revolutionary War officially ignited, it was no coincidence that one of the very first flags flown by the colonial militias years before the Stars and Stripes was the pine tree flag. A simple white banner bearing a single green pine tree and 3 words, an appeal to heaven. The Revolution severed Britain's supply line completely. Overnight, the Royal Navy lost access to the only trees on Earth that could keep its fleet operational. The consequences were devastating and immediate. British warships were forced to sail with repaired, spliced, or rotting masts, patchwork solutions that every captain knew were ticking time bombs. In several critical engagements, British ships didn't lose their masts to enemy cannon fire. The wood simply snapped. Inferior, cobbled-together timber failing under the ordinary stress of wind and wave. At the decisive Battle of the Chesapeake in 1781, the French fleet, supplied with fresh, superior mast timber, outmaneuvered and outfought the British squadron. The battered British fleet couldn't break through to relieve their trapped army at Yorktown. And that was it. The war was effectively over. The masts broke before the Empire did, but only just. This hidden chapter of history completely reframes how we should think about empires and the logistics that sustain them. The British Navy wasn't slowed down by a lack of money. They had plenty of money. It wasn't a shortage of trained sailors or brilliant admirals. They had those too. The most powerful military force on Earth was fundamentally grounded by a broken supply chain for one highly specific, irreplaceable physical component: a straight piece of wood. And this is where it gets interesting, because this isn't just an 18th century problem. It's the exact same vulnerability that haunts us today. Think about the global semiconductor crisis. The entire modern economy, cars, phones, medical devices, military systems, depends on microchips. And the vast majority of the world's advanced chips are manufactured in a handful of factories, concentrated in one specific region. If that supply chain breaks, everything stops. Factories go idle. Economies contract. Militaries lose their technological edge. It's the same structural fragility, just with silicon instead of pine. The British Empire in the 1700s and the global economy in the 2020s share the exact same fatal flaw: a critical dependency on a single, geographically concentrated, irreplaceable resource. And in both cases, the people in charge knew about the vulnerability and couldn't fix it in time. Logistics don't care about your ambitions, your military budget, or your political alliances. Logistics dictate the absolute non-negotiable limits of power. You are only as strong as the weakest, most fragile link in your supply chain. And when that link breaks, it doesn't matter how many cannons you have. The British Empire built the most powerful global system of dominance the world had ever seen. They projected military force across every ocean, controlled trade routes that spanned continents, and governed territories on the other side of the planet. From the outside, they looked unstoppable, invincible. But that entire massive, complex, awe-inspiring machine ultimately rested on a single point of failure. One absurdly specific requirement that no amount of money, manpower, or political maneuvering could replace: the ability to find, cut, and drag a perfect 100-foot tree out of an American forest. They needed that tree to build a mast. They needed the mast to sail a warship. They needed the warship to control the ocean. And they needed the ocean to hold everything else together. When they lost the trees, they lost the colonies. And the empire that ruled the waves began its long, slow retreat from the world it had built. The next time you look at a piece of wood, consider this. Somewhere in history, an empire fell because they couldn't find one that was tall enough. If you're fascinated by the invisible supply chains and forgotten resources that secretly shaped the course of history, consider subscribing. There's always another hidden story behind the empires we thought we understood.